What you're about to hear aren't campfire stories. These are hauntings that British police officers witnessed themselves, on duty, and put into official reports. One officer watched a car crash on the A3 in Surrey. When they searched the wreckage, they found out the driver had been dead for 5 months. 5 cases and 5 police officers who saw something they couldn't explain and said so in writing. This is Spooky Britain. We start with probably the most famous case. In August 1977, on Green Street in Enfield, North London, Peggy Hodgson lived with her 4 children in an ordinary council house. On one of the first nights of disturbance, 2 of the children reported their beds shaking and heavy furniture moving on its own. What followed became one of the most documented poltergeist cases in British history, eventually drawing in the police, journalists, and paranormal researchers who would spend years trying to explain it. Peggy Hodgson was a single mother raising 4 children alone in a modest, unremarkable home. There was nothing in the family's circumstances that suggested any of this was coming, and nothing in the house's history to account for it either. What made Enfield different from countless other reported hauntings was how quickly outside witnesses, including trained officers of the law, found themselves standing in the middle of it. On one of the earliest nights, Mrs. Hodgson called the police after hearing knocking and seeing furniture shift inside the house. Constable Carolyn Heeps arrived expecting a routine disturbance call. Instead, she watched a heavy armchair slide several feet across the living room floor with no one near it. She checked the floor for wires or hidden mechanisms, and checked the chair itself, and found nothing that could explain what she'd just seen. Afterward, she wrote and signed a formal statement describing exactly what she had witnessed, a rare instance of a serving police officer putting a supernatural claim into official written record. In the months that followed, the disturbances escalated well beyond that single incident. Children in the house reported being pulled from their beds by an unseen force, and investigators who later visited recorded knocking sounds, objects moving across rooms, and one of the children speaking in a low, growling voice unlike her own. The case reached its most widely discussed point when a photographer investigating the house captured an image showing one of the children apparently caught mid-air near her bed, as though thrown or launched upward. Witnesses in the house at the time insisted she had been lifted and thrown by something they couldn't see. Skeptics later suggested the image showed nothing more than a child mid-jump on a bed. And the disagreement between those 2 explanations has never been resolved. The disturbances at Green Street eventually faded, and the Hodgson family continued living in the house for years afterward. Constable Heeps's signed statement remains on record to this day, one of the only documents of its kind in British policing. Decades later, researchers, skeptics, and paranormal investigators are still divided over what actually happened inside that house, and no single explanation has ever satisfied everyone who has studied the case. On the 11th of December 2002, at around 7:20 p.m, near Birmingham, Surrey, several drivers travelling the A3 reported seeing a car leave the road ahead of them and crash into the verge. More than one motorist pulled over and called the police, describing the same thing: headlights swerving, then a car disappearing into the undergrowth at speed. The A3 is a major route through Surrey, well used at all hours, and multiple independent witnesses calling in the same incident gave police no reason to doubt they were responding to a genuine, fresh collision. Officers arrived, prepared for an active emergency, expecting to find a driver who needed help. Searching the undergrowth near where witnesses had pointed them, officers eventually found a wrecked maroon-coloured Vauxhall Astra car. But the vehicle was not freshly crashed. It had been there for some time. When police traced the registration, they discovered the car's driver had vanished 5 months earlier, and police analysis discovered it had been there for 5 months from around July 2002. On the grass verge near the vehicle was the decomposed body of the driver, 21-year-old Mr. Christopher Chandler. It turned out that police had been looking for him since July of the same year, but he had completely vanished without a trace around that time. Officers stood at the scene, unable to reconcile what they were looking at with what they'd been told. A car that had clearly been sitting wrecked and abandoned for months had somehow been witnessed by multiple people crashing that same night in real time, as though the original accident were repeating itself for anyone who happened to be driving past. No further explanation was ever recorded, and the case remains logged as a genuine unexplained sighting rather than a hoax or a misidentification, given how many separate witnesses described the same impossible sequence of events. Drivers still use that stretch of the A3 every day, most with no idea that 5 months after one driver's death, several strangers watched his crash happen again. In September 1987, the Stocksbridge Bypass near Sheffield was still under construction, a stretch of new road cut through the Yorkshire hillside. 2 security guards, David Goldthorpe and Stephen Brooks, were on night patrol along the site, tasked with watching over the construction equipment. Just after midnight, in an area miles from any housing, they saw something neither of them expected. Near an electricity pylon by P. Royd Bridge, the 2 men saw a group of children, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, dancing in a circle by the roadside. Concerned for the children's safety, they stopped the car and went to investigate. By the time they reached the spot, the children were gone. The ground beneath them was soft with mud and showed no footprints apart from their own. Shaken, they got back in the vehicle and continued along the bypass. Soon after, they saw a hooded figure standing on the bridge ahead, dressed in what looked like a monk's robes. When they turned their headlights toward it, the beam appeared to pass straight through the figure without illuminating it. Frightened by what they'd seen, the 2 men called both the police and a local clergyman to the scene. Officers who later patrolled the same stretch of road reported an unsettling feeling of being watched, and described their patrol car being struck by a series of unexplained thuds from outside, with no one visible nearby. South Yorkshire Police declined to comment publicly on the incident at the time. The Stocksbridge Bypass has gone on to become one of the most reported haunted roads in Britain, with sightings of the same hooded figure and the same group of children continuing in the decades since. What Goldthorpe and Brooks saw that night in 1987 has never been explained, and the police response that followed remains one of the few times officers themselves reported something unusual at the site, rather than simply responding to someone else's account. In August 1952, the household at 1 Byron Street, Runcorn, was home to 68-year-old Sam Jones, his daughter-in-law Lucy, his teenage grandson John Glynn Jones, John's younger sister Eileen, and an elderly lodger. The disturbances began with visitors staying overnight when the dressing table in their shared bedroom began shaking and moving on its own, loud enough to send all 4 of them fleeing the room. What started as a single unsettling night in a crowded bedroom escalated over the following weeks into something the family could no longer explain away. Word spread locally, and the house became the center of national attention, with people lining up outside hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was happening inside. The activity grew steadily more aggressive and increasingly focused on John. Household items, including books and a clock, were thrown across rooms in front of witnesses. Dresser drawers opened and slammed shut on their own. Furniture struck the walls hard enough to crack the plaster above. John himself was reportedly dragged from his bed and thrown to the floor on repeated occasions, and his clothing was found mysteriously torn. A local medium and a Methodist minister both attempted to intervene. The minister held a vigil in the haunted bedroom but fled after being struck on the head by a flying dictionary. Police were eventually called to the house, and 3 officers who sat down on a large chest on the landing were violently thrown from it by an unseen force. At the height of the disturbance, witnesses described a massive, heavy blanket chest lifting into the air above 2 family members standing beneath it, hovering long enough that both believed they were about to be crushed. Before it could fall, the chest settled gently back down into the corner of the room, undamaged, with no one able to explain what had held it up or brought it down safely. After roughly 10 weeks, the activity stopped as abruptly as it had begun, having caused an estimated £20,000 in damage to the house. The family eventually moved out of Byron Street. The Runcorn case remains one of the lesser-known but most violent poltergeist accounts in British history, overshadowed by Enfield a generation later, and it has never been explained. In 1981, residents of several houses on Thornton Road in the Ward End area of Birmingham began reporting something they couldn't explain. Stones falling on their homes almost every night, smashing windows and damaging roof tiles, with no one ever seen throwing them. At first, residents suspected local vandals or a neighbour with a grudge, and tried to identify the culprit themselves. When that led nowhere, they turned to the police, who took the complaint seriously enough to assign an experienced team to the case. Chief Inspector Len Turley led the investigation, and his officers camped outside the houses overnight through the winter of 1981 into 1982, using night sights, image intensifiers, and automatic cameras to try to catch whoever was responsible. Despite the equipment and the hours spent watching, they saw nothing but foxes, rats, and rabbits. The stones kept falling regardless, night after night, while officers were actively watching. The same team of officers had reportedly solved 5 murder cases in the same stretch of time without making any progress on Thornton Road, a case that, on paper, should have been far simpler to close. No one was ever seriously hurt by the stones, the worst injury on record being a single grazed cheek. But the sheer effort spent without result made this one of the most heavily resourced poltergeist investigations in British police history. By the end of 1982, the investigation was wound down, though the case was never formally closed. Police later suggested the stones might have been thrown from as far as 200 yards away using a homemade catapult, though no such device, or anyone responsible for one, was ever found. Whether that explanation is the true one has never been settled, and Thornton Road remains one of the most documented unsolved poltergeist cases on record. Not one of these cases was ever solved. In every one of them, the people trying hardest to explain it away were the ones with the least reason to believe. If you've got a case you think deserves the same treatment, drop it below. Thanks for watching, and stay curious.